Hi, good evening. I'm Lonnie Stonich, the Executive Director of FAN. We're a nonprofit that presents programming exploring human development across the lifespan. I'm honored to welcome you to tonight's conversation between Dr. Aliza Pressman and Dr. Tina Payne Bryson. Thanks for joining us tonight. FAN's YouTube channel has an archive of over 300 videos of past events, so be sure to subscribe to the channel to get updates when new recordings are posted. And now for a few introductions. Dr. Aliza Pressman is a developmental psychologist with nearly 2 decades of experience working with families and the healthcare providers who care for them. She is an assistant clinical professor in the Division of Behavioral Health Department of Pediatrics at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai Hospital, where she is the co-founding director of the Mount Sinai Parenting Center. Aliza is also the host of a hit podcast, Raising Good Humans. Her brand new book, The 5 Principles of Parenting, just landed on the New York Times bestseller list in its first week. Gotta love that. Tina Payne Bryson is the author of The Bottom Line for Baby and co-author with Dan Siegel, whom we had the pleasure of hosting in 2016, of The Power of Showing Up, The Yes Brain, and 2 New York Times bestsellers herself, The Whole Brain Child and No Drama Discipline, each of which has been translated into, hold on to it, over 50 languages. Tina is a psychotherapist and the founder and executive director of the Center for Connection, a multidisciplinary clinical practice, and of the Play Strong Institute, a center devoted to the study, research, and practice of play therapy through a neurodevelopmental lens. Whew. Let's welcome Aliza Pressman and Tina Payne Bryson.
What an honor it is to get to celebrate you and your beautiful work. For those of you who may not know, Aliza and I are colleagues, but we're also friends. That happened because of her podcast. She was interviewing me about one of my books, and we actually never hit record. We talked for hours and did that 2 or 3 times before we ever got the recording down. So I am thrilled tonight to let you shine and talk about your incredible work that I adore. I have bought stacks of them. My neighbors are getting them. My clinicians at my center are getting them. I'm thrilled about the book. So I'm so excited to do this with you.
I'm so excited to do this with you. I'm so grateful to be here. And I obviously am so honored when this esteemed colleague, who is someone I have looked up to for so long, is up for doing this.
Well, you and I could easily talk about everything for hours and hours, but let's dig right in so that everybody can get some of your brilliance. So one of the things that you and I have talked about a lot, which is very much an exciting thing with a downside, is how much noise is out there. There are so many social media posts and resources. Parents are privileged to get all kinds of advice, but it can also make us as parents, and I'm the mom of 3 kids who are now adolescents and young adults, it can make us feel like if our children's lunches aren't cut into woodland creature shapes, that we are doing a terrible job as parents. So there's so much noise, there's so much advice out there. How do you help parents find their way and their North Star in this book for knowing what's really important and what kind of noise we can tune out?
Well, I so empathize about that, and I have struggled with it. I think it's one of those things where I wanted to create a book that could serve as guidance and support, so it's not chaotic, but not so much that it makes everyone feel rigid and confined. So I really leaned into the science, and I chose 5 core principles from the science that we know. This is not me. This is the science of how humans develop and how children thrive, and parents, frankly. And I chose the things that we know are absolutely robustly studied and relevant to anybody across cultures and communities that can help us, guide us, and then everything else, really, we can turn the volume down. If we're leaning into these core principles more often than not, the rest is noise, unless it makes you feel better, and then go for it.
Look, if you want to cut some woodland creature shape out of your kid's sandwich and it makes you happy, we're not knocking that.
Right.
Go for it. Well, okay, so the way you really, by studying the science and all your experience, and as a mom too, pulling together these 5 principles that allow parents to say, like, what do I really need to say? Like, what are the main things I really should focus on? And I don't even have to do it perfectly. You make that very clear. And the rest I can forget about. Why don't we walk through each of those 5 principles?
Okay.
So do you have a favorite? Or I mean, does the order matter to you? What do you want to start with?
The order doesn't matter to me. I started with relationship because we know that relationship is so inextricably linked to development that I think it's Dr. Jack Shonkoff, who runs the Harvard Center for the Developing Child, who says quite simply, there is no development without relationships.
Yeah.
So I chose relationships first, but I didn't order them like do this one first. It's just, it felt like at the core of this is about relationships, and then the rest kind of fall into place. And I don't have a favorite. It depends on the day and my mood. And I hope that's true for everyone. But I do think that they all are interconnected. And so one without the other is, it almost can't stand alone, just because it doesn't, because nothing is really in a vacuum.
Yeah.
So relationship, I also think there is a part of me that feels like reflection is actually written as the second one. But as people will see in the book, I don't go through the book like, this is what I want to say about relationship. This is what I want to say about reflection. This is what I want to say about regulation. This is what I want to say about rules and repair. I really try to weave it in and almost just like make a mark of where you're seeing it in real time, so that nobody feels that it's this rigid, ordered operation.
And I think that makes so much sense, because really a huge part of relationship is repair and reflection. Like they're all, there's an interwovenness to them. But I think it would be really helpful for us to walk through all 5 and talk about, like, sort of what do you feel like you would want parents to walk away with as kind of like an eagle's eye view, let's start with relationships and reflection. What do you want parents to most know about those 2?
So I think my favorite thing about relationship is that it is the most powerful influence, let me say, environmental influence on our children's development. And to me, the fact that the parenting relationship is the most powerful environmental influence can at first sound very overwhelming. Like, that is like that's big. But the truth is that to me, it's relieving, because we know that we love our kids and we know we can't control anything but ourselves. So if we actually can have impact, to me, that feels like, if you let go of the bigness of it and just think, and here's where I think it really lands. When we look at stressors and we look at positive, tolerable, and toxic stressors, and we know that experiencing toxic stress, which we can get into, but just to be clear, toxic stress is not getting a part in the play. It's not having a new sibling. It's not stuff like that. We're talking
not getting a B-,
not getting a B-, not even getting a D.
Right.
It's truly about things that you would never wish upon a child or a human.
Trauma.
Real deep trauma.
Yeah.
And the fact that even kids who are experiencing what would be categorized as toxic stress, that when they have the support of a loving and safe relationship with their caregiver, and it just takes one, that it moves the category of the stressor into tolerable, and tolerable has a shot at building resilience. To me, that is a reminder for all of us every day, because it's like, well, hopefully our kids are not experiencing anything like that. But that means that for the positive stressors, the light stuff, we don't even have to worry. We need that. It's imperative to building resilience. And the fact that in the context of this close relationship, we can even have the terrible stuff happen and have growth, that is such a relief. And I want everybody to just kind of let that land, because how many times a week do we say, like, is this moment too much for my child? Have I wrecked them? Did my response ruin them? Am I a terrible parent? And the answer is just almost always no.
Yeah. My favorite, when I talk about my book, The Power of Showing Up, one of the ways I summarize that book is that based on lots and lots of research by lots and lots of amazing people, that we know that one of the best predictors for how well kids turn out on everything they're measured on is that they've had what's called secure attachment with at least one person. And the way when I give that talk, the way I end that talk always is what your child needs most from you is you. Flawed you, imperfect you, falling apart you, sometimes don't even know that you even are a you. Your child needs you. And I think there's what you just said is when you first hear it, it's like, oh crap, my kid's like doomed then. But actually there's tremendous freedom that just you showing up, being in relationship
is enough.
Not perfectly is not only enough, it's the thing that they need most for optimal development, even if they have horrible traumas that happen to them. So I think it's tremendously freeing and hopeful, full of hope.
I agree. That's what it is. It's hopeful. And you said something once, remember, now, of course, I can't remember, but it was a better way of explaining toxic stress moving to tolerable stress, almost like in the context of relationship, we when we have that and we experience these stressors, we build resilience out of that context. We have fragility. But it is so relieving, and it's just something to keep on remembering. And to your point about even showing up as our imperfect selves, and we'll get into this when we talk about repair, but I think we would all argue that our imperfect selves are more beneficial to our kids than a perfect version of ourselves because of the burden that is having a perfect parent. If anybody had a perfect parent, obviously it's not a really perfect parent, because to be perfect, you would have to have the flaws to show the repair and show the mistakes and show that that's right. Okay. But the idea, the image, the perceived perfect parent, it would be a burden. And then you grow up and you get into the world and you just feel like, I am not worthy because I am not perfect. And the caregiver that I loved so much, that I had this secure relationship with, was able to do that. So what's wrong with me? So I think we all agree that the falling on our face as parents sometimes is more important for our kids thriving than never doing that.
I love that. And while we're here, why don't we go ahead and talk about repair, since we're here? Because
Okay.
you said that so beautifully. And I think what's so powerful about repair is not just what you said, but the science is really clear that our children benefit when we mess up, not just because they don't have to be perfect, and they know then that we don't expect them to be perfect.
Right.
But also they learn some relational tolerance in that they learn like, okay, so, my mom, and look, I'm going to not tell you that this is a made up story. This is an actual story, but I was playing Yahtzee with my boys. They were fighting. I didn't make a boundary soon enough. And so I continued to get more and more frustrated. I end up throwing the dice across the room and yelling at my kids. And, immediately, or within a couple of minutes, I pull myself back into a regulated state, and then I repair with them. And the way that sounded for me in that moment was, I did not handle that the way I wish I had handled it. I really wish I had done that differently. I got so mad, and I should have taken a break. I should have went and calmed myself down and then come. And I'm so sorry. I know I sounded crazy and I frightened you with my voice. Can I have a do-over? Will you forgive me? So it looks something like that. But what's amazing is in that moment, our kids are like, oh my gosh, this feels terrible right now. Like the messiness of this relationship and her being mad and she's not cool right now and I don't like her. So they're sitting in the discomfort of the messiness of inevitable conflict in relationship. But they know when we consistently repair, that they're like, oh, she's going to come make it right in a minute. So they can tolerate even the discomfort before the repair when we consistently do that. So they learn to say, oh, if my friend gets mad at me or if I upset my friend, it doesn't mean the relationship is over. So it builds some resilience there. What else do you say about repair?
I think that's it. I mean, we know with muscle building, you need to have these tiny little tears in your muscles, allegedly.
Love that.
And that is how you grow bigger muscles. And for a healthy, strong relationship, you need those tiny little ruptures in order to build that stronger connection, so that you do go into the world and you do have this sense of permanence in the love. The foundation is so strong that things can happen, earthquakes can happen, not the ones that are like this is so California, but not the ones that are, going to swallow the universe, but the little ones that you're like, oh yeah, anyway, the house isn't going to come down, moving right along. And and then you don't have that feeling when you get into relationships with adults or with peers that there's one rupture and you're just like, I guess that's it then. And so I think it's so important for the strength of the relationship between the parent and the child, and it extends to our relationships with other people. And the other thing that I think is important, and I just experienced this, not that Tina and I need to tell you all of our moments of our flawed moments, but I'll share this because it happened this morning and I'm not proud, but I think it speaks to how we can see the relationship and the repair, is that my daughter overslept and I had a meeting. So I needed to take her to school and get back in time for my meeting. And she had some thing that she had to be at school. So all the things, I was like, well, if she's late, I'm going to look like the worst mom. And that's so blah, blah, blah. And then I'm going to get back. And I got all in my head about it. I wasn't conscious of that. I wasn't planning to lose it, but I didn't take the time. And I just was like, and I barked a lot and loudly. And then we got into the car and she said, we're finished now with this. Like, do you feel like, I know I made a mistake. Do you feel like you need to keep on yelling about it? And I was like, no, I feel I've made my point. And she said, okay, I'm sorry about that. This is what happened. And also, like, everything's going to be okay. And I said, I love you. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to freak out. And we had a laugh about it. And I was like, you know what? I have to remember that even in the moments of repair, we get the opportunity to build. Like, I got to forgive myself quickly because I was reminded she's not afraid of me. She knew that I was barking, but I'm not, that was it. And I wasn't proud of it. And it was a dysregulated moment for me, but we have the kind of relationship where it didn't turn into something else because we just were like, we can get through this. And it was a laugh and a moment of connection. And then we put on a song that we both love and sang to it and moved along, and the day was fine. And I just think, like, we can berate ourselves and we can, go get so upset about it. But if we look at how on balance our kids respond to us and we see that they actually feel safe, it's just a great reminder in those moments when we're just like, oh, why did I screw up like that? Like, why did I do that? It was so not how I want to be, that it's okay. And now sometimes discord, the only other thing I want to say about repair is that sometimes we have this idea that it has to be this beautiful, lengthy conversation. And sometimes it's just like, it when it's happening. It's a reconnection. It's not about fixing something that's broken. It's truly about reconnecting when there's been a disconnect. And that feels more, or maybe it's just that it feels less scripted. It feels more like this is just how people interact. They have messy dance steps, they step on toes, and then they get back in line.
Yeah, sometimes you can even be like, hey, sorry about earlier, and give them a squeeze, and that's it.
Yeah,
that's all you
move
need
along.
to do. Yeah. I think oftentimes as parents, when we have these moments, and this will lead us into talking about reflection, we beat ourselves up. And when you talk about reflection, you're not talking about laying in bed for hours thinking about all the horrible things.
Yeah.
That's not what we're talking about when you talk about reflection. And really, it's much more, I would say, kind of the link between like repair and moving into reflection is curiosity and really being curious, like what got in the way of me being the parent I wanted to be in that moment.
Exactly.
And sometimes it's like, what got in the way is my kid's really annoying and I haven't fevered myself in 4 years and I'm really hungry. Like maybe that's it. And sometimes it's more, but also that doesn't have to be a super scripted kind of thing. Tell us what you mean when you say reflection and why that's so essential. It's like one of the 5 principles. A lot of people really won't even know what you mean when you say reflection. Tell us about it.
Yeah. And I do think it's like the secret sort of like unsung hero of the 5 principles, because you really, whenever we're talking about this, we all go back to reflection, but we don't necessarily name it. But being curious, not only about what your child needs right then, like what skill do they need? What are they trying to say to me? That's part of reflection. Part of reflection is, what did I need? What do I need in order to be able to respond the way I want to more often than not? What could I do differently? What could I provide for myself that's different? And then also reflection is how, taking the time when you have it to just think about, what was my experience being parented? What was my experience being loved and loving? And how is that informing the choices I make as a parent? And reflection is also helping our kids learn to reflect so that we can be curious and help them wonder instead of going right to what was wrong or what was awful or whatever, to help kind of build their wiring in such a way that they have that capacity for reflection. And finally, reflection is breathing and taking a pause. It's that step before we regulate. In order for us to regulate, you kind of need to take a pause and give yourself space. And in that space, I truly believe, as you mentioned with relationship, that freedom of understanding the value and strength of having a securely attached relationship. There's freedom in that. There is freedom in that knowledge, and there is freedom in building space to make the choices that you need to make and want to make, again, more often than not. So reflection to me is almost, I mean, that's the thing. There's no order because they're so vital for us. But I would say reflection's the one that we would try to get rid of right away. And in the book, I have like step 1, breathe, and no, you can't skip that part. But it's so spectacularly important to value just breathing. And really, if you do nothing but promise yourself that you're going to take a breath so that you have that reflection space before anything else, just this week as an exercise, it does, unless there's an actual emergency. Like, no, please don't take a breath if your child's running into the street. Please do not. Like, we have a stress response for a reason. But if you can, that is freedom to really be the parent that you want to be.
That pause is what allows us to respond instead of react. And I think what's so crucial too is that, the part of the brain that gives rise to empathy is also the part of the brain that gives rise to insight. So the more we reflect, the more we can actually be empathetic with ourselves and bring self-compassion, but the more we can tune into and have empathy for our children as well, and really read their signals and what they need. And so it's kind of a superpower, and Dan Siegel has this phrase that he made, this word that he made up. He always makes up words that don't exist, which is so fun. But the word is mindsight, and it's the ability to see your own mind and the minds of others. And that's really what we're talking about here too, in terms of this reflection piece. Is the more you practice doing it, like I love you said, like just this week, just pause, take a breath. The more we even practice that, the more it becomes automatic for us. And we get, just like I loved your analogy about the muscles. Just like when we do reps, building, lifting weights, our muscles get stronger. What that leads to is our brain firing and wiring so that there's automaticity around a pause and a response, unless there's an emergency and our threat response is going on, which we need to listen to. So I think that's really, really important, is to know that the more we do it, the easier it gets for us. And I'll say one other thing too, and that is that we've known about this since the 1930s, but Andrew Huberman, in his wonderful podcast, the Huberman Lab podcast, has made something called the physiological sigh very popular. And really all it is having your exhale longer than your inhale. And I remember when my kids were really little, I did something that Dan Siegel taught me to do, which is to put a hand on my heart and a hand on my stomach, and then take a shorter inhale through my nose and a longer exhale out through my mouth, which just looks like this. And I would do it once or twice, and it helped me not yell. But what was funny is that over time, my kids came to know that if I was doing it, I was on the brink of losing it. So they would kind of rein themselves in, like, oh, we've pushed her to that point, right? Because we're patient, and we get no credit from our kids for that until we're not. And then they remember that moment, right? So I love that you focus on reflection as one of the 5, because I really think it is the unsung hero, and it's a superpower. that we can also teach our kids how to do. And that leads
Exactly.
us to, oh, go ahead.
And that leads us, no, it does lead us to regulation. And at the end of each chapter, I have a reflection exercise and a regulation exercise, very specifically because of what you said. We need to, this is stuff that is, and they're quick. They're not, I'm a
You get
parent.
it.
I'm like, I want no homework for anyone that isn't embedded in already existing moments. So like, if you're going to be taking a shower anyway, take a shower and breathe, like with intention. If you're going to be driving to school anyway, there's like a 1 minute thing to do with your child, like nothing that is an add-on.
No one's meditating for 3 hours before
No
school.
meditate. Exactly. Just reality. But it's so effective. And I think that like, I actually remember when my kids were little, they had the same thing where I did either I would count my fingers to 10 and then they would imitate me and they would know. And I was like, oh, I'm yelling. I'm just doing it this way. And then of course the hack of, you really do want to put your hand on your heart. It's a little oxytocin hit and it helps you regulate, which actually brings us to self-regulation and regulation. And so I think with regulation and reflection and regulation are kind of married. There's no way to do one without the other, but I like to think of that part of it, the pause part of it, the breath part of it that gets us to regulate as finding the passcode to your internal alarm system.
Love that.
And Tina's heard this before. But because I moved to Los Angeles from an apartment in New York City, and in New York City, if you're from New York City, this makes sense, but you're in a big apartment building and you just don't get an alarm because you're not worried because I don't know, people can hear you. It just feels very safe. And then when I moved to a house in the middle of a canyon, I got a really strong alarm system, maybe ridiculous. And when I opened the door to test it the first time and I heard the slow beeping sound that you get when you have your little 15-second window of warning before
hurry.
Totally. I was like, oh, that's about the window we have when we notice that there are signals that we might flip our lid back to, I can't even remember which one of the books that you guys wrote where that was in.
It's in Whole Brain Child.
There you go. That you can see the warning signals, pay attention to them, get really good at paying attention to them, and therefore help your child get really skilled at paying attention to them. And then you can put in that passcode. You can tell yourself, I don't need to call the police. I don't need to get the fire department here. This is not an emergency. This child is safe and I am safe. There's time for me to respond. And it is so powerful because like we know that regulation, having self-regulation skills is more predictive of school success and life success than IQ. So if we know this, that's another, muscle we want to build, but it's unfortunately or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, you can't do it without working on your own regulation because, and this is something that Tina and I talk about all the time, we co-regulate. We're not alone on this planet. And certainly with developing nervous systems, they borrow our nervous system. And so this is something that helps them grow that skill while their brains aren't fully developed to be able to just have access to self-regulate. And was it Yahtzee you were playing?
Yeah.
Per the Yahtzee or the school, like being late for school moments, we too need to keep practicing and we have fully developed brains. So I think regulation, both self and co-regulation are, you really want to buy into that because it is game changing.
It's so huge. I actually was just doing some teaching on attachment science this week. And one of the things I was talking about is that, as mammals, our caregivers being able to tune into us and adjust our physiological states of hunger and body temperature and all these things are what we need to actually survive. So this is really fundamental to who we are and what we need. And I love when Dan talks about regulation, he kind of like breaks that down a little bit more to talk about monitoring and modifying. And I think that's a really helpful way to think about what we mean when we talk about regulation. Here's what I'd love to hear about before we move on to rules. Where do people get things wrong when, and you and I have had multiple conversations about this, including a whole podcast episode, when it comes to, I think the whole idea of regulation and co-regulation is very tied into the gentle parenting movement. What are some of the misconceptions about gentle parenting and regulation and co-regulation? I know, hours.
Hours. We really did a whole episode on like, what's the deal with gentle parenting to talk about this, because first of all, some versions of it are fantastic. Some versions are not, because it's not scientific. It's just it's pop culture. So it really depends. But I think what we've landed on is that it's really confusing to two things. One, I think a big confusion is that we have to pretend to be calm. That would be not remotely co-regulation, because a pretend nervous system does not exist.
Right.
You can't pretend anything. So if you're trying to co-regulate, imagine like there's a whole other universe of two nervous systems communicating with each other. So you might have, like, one of the misconceptions that you'd have this robotic tone and you would just be very chill, and it would be
You're really angry right now.
Yeah.
Creepy.
And that is creepy. And so we do not recommend that. But I think that gets mistranslated or misinterpreted. It's not
Like
that.
almost as emotionless.
Yeah.
Like regulation and co-regulation is supposed to be this
Means you're
robotic,
dead inside.
emotionless, sociopathic, actually, approach. And it's not. Like, it should be an authentic, and we can even be regulated and be frustrated. Like, you can be
Exactly.
frustrated and regulated. You can be angry and regulated. So you might even bring some energy into your voice and from your nervous system. It doesn't sound like a robot.
It doesn't sound like a robot. And if it does, it's time for reflection. What's going on there? Why? What am I having trouble accessing? And one thing to just think of with co-regulation, like, if nothing else, what you want to do is, if your child is dysregulated, let's say you have a tantruming toddler, it's not that you're going to say, I don't feel anything and this isn't frustrating. What you're saying inside to regulate is, my child is safe. So I don't need to set my alarm off to protect their well-being and life. I can actually have space to get myself feeling safe, not going into a stress response, so that I'm available to them. But it doesn't have anything to do with, like, some zombie-like response. So that's one thing that's really different. And you can also say to yourself, I'm annoyed, but my child is safe and I'm safe. So you can be regulated and annoyed, to your point, because the dysregulated part, the part where you can't co-regulate and be available, is because you think there's an emergency. And so really just exercising the skill to be able to distinguish between a real and imagined threat, that's what you're doing. It's just letting yourself know, is there a reason for me to call the police or, like, have the stress response? Do I need to, are we running from a saber-toothed tiger? Is there a bear chasing me? And if you're able to ask yourself and tell yourself no, you've gotten there, and then you're more available. So that's one thing that's just, I think, frustrating for us to watch. It's also true for animals. It's true for humans. It's true, not that we're not animals, but you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's true for everyone in all areas, cultures, communities, socioeconomic status. It's not one of those things that you have to pay for. And it's not one of those things, it's totally free, accessible. I mean, that was one of the things that was really important to me. What are things that are in our control and accessible to us no matter what? And time and again, we've seen that this moves the needle in terms of predicting regulation skills in our kids and for our own thriving. So it's worth putting the effort into, and it's worth exercising those muscles. I guess another misinterpretation with the idea of co-regulating is that you're responsible for how your child is regulating in that moment. And so that you might hear people say, well, this didn't work. And I think we just have to reframe what working means. Working is that we regulated ourselves, so our kids can go ahead and have the feelings that they're having without getting a cue from us that there's danger in that feeling. But
Right.
that doesn't mean that they're going to be like, yes, I have to calm down now because my parent is so calm. That's not what we're talking about. Sometimes that might actually be what happens, because they might look to us and see that if there was an emergency, there would be an indication.
Yeah.
But that's not always going to be the case. And when you think it is, and that's what you're expecting, it's another misunderstanding.
Yeah, I think one of the ways to think about it is like, are we like the opposite of regulation is amplifying your child's states of distress, which we will all do, and then we repair. But really, regulation is sort of like that safety, but it might look like lots of different things, because our kid is a unique individual who is in different states at different times, and we are too. And sometimes you have time to sit and hold space and say, oh buddy, you're so frustrated, I'm right here with you, what do you need, how can I help? And other times it might be your child's melting down and you have to get in the car, and you don't have to stop everything and have a reflective conversation. It may be like, oh, it's so hard to get out the door, we got to go. And you scoop up and you grab your stuff, and you're just working hard to breathe and pause so you're not amplifying their distress. So that's sometimes what regulation can look like too.
This is a whole other topic we could talk about for days, because we're both very interested in not only regulation, but the interpretation of regulation and co-regulation, because it does seem to hit some spots. And I think it actually leads right into rules.
Perfect.
And the confusion, right?
Yeah, and especially because where gentle parenting, I think, has gotten off track is that the rules part, right? So there's kind of an emphasis on emotional responsiveness and the nurture part and the connection piece and all of this stuff. And but without also holding the importance of boundaries and structure and rules. So talk about why rules are so important for development.
We know rules, and I said rules because they needed an R word.
Right. But you can mean structure, boundaries, limit setting, all those things.
So, and in the book, I sort of distinguish between boundaries and limits, but like the interpersonal boundaries and the limits that we set behaviorally, because ultimately our kids need to feel emotionally and physically safe in order to be in close relationships, in order to move through the world, in order to thrive. So rules are about safety. And again, it's about physical safety and emotional safety, not just for our kids, but for others, because they have to be members of society and our small family. And they can't move through the world sort of just in, like where we're just like chasing their feels. But it can feel confusing if in making a rule, your child is dysregulated because they don't like the rule. And then you have to have that strange moment of, wait, I thought I'm supposed to be sensitive to their needs. How am I being sensitive if I'm the reason they're upset and I can't fix it? Because we get why that's confusing, but that's why I tried to really simplify it. You can have a connection. You can regulate. You can say, I see what's happening for you. I know how hard this is. Again, when you have time. And also, don't make rules that you don't believe in, because when you believe in your boundaries and you believe in the limits that you've set to teach them how to move through the world in a way that allows them to be in community, then they are safe and they feel like they can understand what's expected of them. It's a wonderful way to be. It really is. And when you don't know what the rules are, they're constantly changing, and you have to spend your energy on the balance board trying to balance, instead of spending your energy learning and growing and being and having joy. That's exhausting, and it's highly linked with internalizing disorders, let's call them, even though I don't love that language, but it's anxiety provoking. We like to know the boundaries that are appropriate. And also we need to know them so that we believe that we can set appropriate boundaries. And limits are there to help us understand the expectations of our movement in the world. So rules are critical for safety, and they make relationships stronger.
Yeah.
And we shy away from them because sometimes it turns into a fear that we're going to end up being controlling with those rules, or we're going to end up being rigid with those rules, and we're going to forget about the relationship. Because there's the extreme version where you just think about rules would be an authoritarian parent who is just, because I said so, and there isn't a sense of thoughtfulness and concern for the emotional side of things. But that's not what we're talking about. And I think because the pendulum just swings so wildly, we get so extreme. And I think, this book is as middle path as can be, and that's not as exciting sounding, but it is so important. So rules are there to keep us safe.
I love that so much because, one of my very favorite things you say is, and there are a lot of them, but one of them is all feelings are welcome and all behaviors are not. So you could even be holding limits
Exactly.
while being emotionally responsive to your child's feelings about the limits, right?
Every single time that you have the energy.
Exactly. And sometimes you just don't, and that's perfectly fine. We don't, it's again, like, I love how you really make an emphasis of like on mass, like most of the time, or enough, that's enough. I think too, like having limits gives our kids practice putting the brakes on, and having to not have things go the way they want. And so that builds resilience too. And that's actually the sixth R that your book really talks about, even though there's five of the principles, is that these fives lead to resilience. So talk about resilience and how that it's really something a lot of parents care about. It's really one of our goals for every parent I ever have talked to. How do we cultivate resilience in our kids?
Well, so it was really important to me to recognize that culturally, for whatever reason, and I guess I do understand why, but we tend to hold resilience as the responsibility of the individual. That a person is or isn't resilient because of something inside of them. And so we love a story of someone who rises up in the face of adversity, setbacks, or trauma and thrives, because it makes us feel hopeful, which I totally understand. But if you look under the hood, I assure you that that person that we're saying is so resilient had the support of someone. If it wasn't one caregiver, it was a coach, it was a teacher. There was one adult who was there for him, who saw them, who believed in them, who helped them feel secure, and who helped them feel loved for exactly who they are. And so I want to say that because resilience rests on relationships, and it doesn't just exist in a vacuum for one person. There are skills that we can build in our kids, which I go over in the book, that are highly linked with resilience. And there is parenting that is highly linked with resilience, the 5 R's that we just talked about. They are a pathway to resilience. They are the most we can do to guarantee that for our part of this, which is not everything, because there's temperament and there's the world around us and circumstances and everything and individual differences. But for the part that is our responsibility, that is the core of resilience building.
Yeah, I love that. Oh, go ahead.
No, that's it. That's all I was going to say. And then just the temperament is also going to play into it. So there are going to be kids who feel like their bounce back ability is stronger. And that's temperament. They came into this world like dandelions, and they're going to grow with whatever sunlight, water, and soil they get, as long as they get a little sunlight, water, and soil. And there are other kids that need a little bit more of the 5 R's to help them build those beliefs and capacities, but it's there. It's possible. We can all be robust in the context of support. It just doesn't mean that it's as easy for some people. but it's definitely not, the onus is not on the individual. I guess part of why I'm careful about that is also when you hear stories about resilience that are beautiful and inspiring, it's one thing. But then when you hear about someone who doesn't have that response, I don't like us blaming people for not being resilient. But there's so much we can do. Like, to me, it is, again, it's the most heartening science. The fact that we know that these 5 R's buffer the effect of the stuff coming our way is so inspiring. And then, we all want our kids to have that bounce back ability. And hopefully it's for the smaller stuff. Like, hopefully it's not for the big, terrible things. It's for the small stuff that we think, why do some kids just kind of keep going and it seems like other kids don't? And then we can look at the part that is in our control. Are we teaching our kids how to dress for the weather, or are we teaching our kids that we will protect them from any weather that comes their way? I think if we really think about it, we're trying to teach our kids how to look at the weather, assess what to do, learn what to wear, and believe that it's survivable.
Really monitoring and modifying for themselves, which would be what we would call self-regulation. I love that because, as I was reading the book back in the early manuscript days,
Very early.
I often think about like kids who are neurodiverse or kids who have like, inborn kind of like more sensitive or different kinds of things that might make the world a little bit more challenging at times. And what I love about this is, regardless of what, every kid has some sort of challenge, right? Like I have a kid who had significant medical challenges, et cetera, whatever those are. The formula I think you were referring to before that you and I talked about is like adversity, and we'll put in your language, adversity minus the 5 principles leads to fragility, and adversity plus the 5 principles leads to resilience. And that, I think, I have like, I won't talk about specifically, but like I have one kid who was born like the highest maximum amount of empathy ever any human ever had. And then I had one that had very low natural inborn empathy. And maybe what they're capable of around those things are, we have constraints from our temperament. We have genetic constraints. We have environmental constraints. We have these constraints on us. And what the 5 principles do is maximize and stretch whatever the capacity is. And so, my kid, after I invest a lot of reps of building empathy, may not ever be as empathetic as one of his brothers, but it's going to be the max that he can be for who he is. And that's beautiful. And we celebrate his other areas where he has, greater capacity. So I just love that whatever constraints we have as parents, I certainly have some temperamental constraints. I am a control freak. I like things just so. And I have 3 boys who don't even see or notice if I put tennis shoes all over the kitchen counter, no one would notice that. And like they don't notice it. And so that's kind of a trivial one, but that's a constraint of my nervous system, that I like things really organized and I like things controlled. Living with 3 children, life is not controlled and not neat and not organized. So we bring our own constraints. Our children have their own constraints, and I bring my gifts and they have their gifts. And really the 5 S's is really the North Star for how we get to thriving. What would you say is like, your beautiful podcast, which I adore, is called Raising Good Humans. This book really is kind of the recipe for how to raise good humans. Is there anything else you want to say about that and the book at all?
Well, I would say that is exactly what I wanted, was this recipe, but with the acknowledgement that how each of us defines good human is totally different. Like the recipe is just, the first half of the book is the science. The second half is applying it in these real world, typical challenging circumstances by age, from infant to adolescence. But the thing that I don't do, there are exercises in there to carry us through, like what is our family mission statement? What are our personal values? What is a good human to me? But what I don't do is tell you, this is the mission statement you should have. This is the value system you should have. This is the, this is the answer to what a good human is. I do believe we all know exactly what that means, but we each have a different definition of it. And I thank goodness we do. So the world is a more interesting place. But I hope that this gives tools to be able to get there for whatever works for you. And I think the challenge in our field is to be able to deliver and translate what can be helpful without imposing judgment on what feels like it works for your family.
I love that so much. And I, you know, you all, if you haven't read the book yet, I know you are now because you've bought the book. And the second half of the book really walks people through, not in a prescriptive way, like step A and step B and step B12, you know, like it's really much more like, how do you take the tricky parts of parenting? Bath time, homework time, screen time limits, like all of those things, and apply these 5 principles to those moments. But you do it in such a beautiful way that's not prescriptive, but more sort of like showing how it can look. And then to take it for your own family, like what works for you and all of that. If we have parents here, and we're in the last 3 minutes, if we have parents who are listening right now who feel like, I don't even know where to begin with the 5 principles, and I just don't, I don't know that I'll ever know how to do this. Can you talk about the idea of fluency and where to start and a message of hope as we wrap up?
Yes, I would say that that is how I designed the book, to try to help us become fluent by just, for example, answering a question and then putting in parentheses very specifically, here's the answer, and then in parentheses, which one of the principles I use to answer that question. And I think, like, we're all growing. We are born as parents as soon as our kids are born, and not a day earlier. And so it's important for us to recognize where we are developmentally in this transition to parenthood and in this growth as parents. And how wonderful. I mean, my message of hope is definitely like, how wonderful and curious and exciting is it to not just know everything, and to be able to say, like, I think I'm figuring this out. And I think we can be here to help make that easier. And I think fluency just comes with practice and with trying things out in different settings. It's like, to me, it was the difference between like teaching a kid to memorize a word and teaching a child how to walk around and recognize a word in any context. That fluency is what I was going for. That whatever context is coming your way, this will be able to become something that is a bit of the North Star to get you to be feeling like you've got this. And I also want to say, of course, you've got this. Everybody who showed up, I mean, it's a very self-selecting group, people curious and open to learning and growing as parents. Your kids are so lucky, and you are doing this. I hope this makes it easier. I hope this gives relief. But there is, there is something about showing up that means you are on such a beautiful path.
Love that. That's so beautiful. And really, again, you make such a nice emphasis that we don't have to be perfect, that being engaged and working on those 5 S's is
5
really
R's. S's is Dan.
Yeah.
Tina and Aliza, thanks for a great conversation. Obviously, you have great chemistry together, which always helps, but I really appreciated, Tina, that you walked folks through the book really skillfully. And I appreciate that. Sometimes people in these situations, especially when they know each other very well, sometimes they can just zoom right through and sometimes kind of forget that, like, most people here haven't yet read the book, and the 2 of you might know the book, but we don't. And you did a really great job. I think people were able to really pass through, and it was very helpful. I want to remind everyone that we're going to be doing an after hours with Aliza that'll be starting at 8:05 Central, and about 4 + 5 is 9 minutes from now. You get to come to after hours by buying a copy of Aliza's book from our partner bookseller, The Bookstall. We've been putting commercials in chat about it. There's one more there right now. And we're doing a BOGO tonight. So if you buy a copy of the book and come to after hours, then we will gift you a second copy that you can give to a friend, a relative, your kid's teacher, whoever you think might be helpful. So I just want to put that out there. There were a couple questions that came in. I'm going to ask for one is a quick clarifying question. We have about 4 minutes left. The book, can you give us an age range, Aliza, of what age kids are you kind of talking about for parenting in the book, just to clarify?
This is kids of all ages. So I tried to structure the book so that in the second part where I'm talking about practical stuff, I address things and then talk about how it impacts development and how to respond based on the age. So I'll say for infants, this, for preschooler, for school age, for middle school, for adolescents, et cetera. That was very important to me because I just wanted everything housed under one roof.
Okay.
Today we used a lot of young examples, but the principles are the same. A tantruming toddler and a teenager that is upset because they can't
Tantruming
go to a
teenager.
party. Same thing.
Yeah,
I mean-
Aliza and our kids are middle school and up. And like I have a 23-year-old, 20-year-old, and a 17-year-old. And these 5 principles, I was so happy to get to go through them with Aliza because it's such a good reminder. This is what I'm doing every day. And sometimes it's like, ooh, I need to focus on rules here. Oh, no, wait, I need to focus on repair here. It really is. And by the way, all 5 principles are fabulous for any relationship. Those are the 5 principles for marriage and being a daughter and a friend, all of it.
I appreciate that. And then let's see, we're at 7:58, so you got about 2 minutes. So then a question came in from Roberta. She's watching from Brazil. She wants to know, how can we help parents look at their children's teachers in schools as reliable partners in raising good humans? So kind of how do you extrapolate outward into, let's say, schools in particular?
I would say first, I think we do it ourselves, and because we can control ourselves. And then, and I just want to emphasize that because there is just too much. Because even if you got the school, then it's the teacher, then it's the friends, then it's the partner. So really leaning into, I'm going to do this myself. That in and of itself will build these, I think we just want to emphasize that power because it's the only one we have. And then separately, I think inviting schools to consider those same 5 principles. It's the same thing for teachers. It's the same thing for school administrators. Like Tina said, it's the same thing for all. These principles I framed it for parenting because that's my jam. But I think that the best way to remember this for schools is, how am I even connecting with the school? Am I going in with my own reflection, with the relationship? Am I, coming at them with, here's what you're doing wrong? Or am I first showing up as a partner? All of these things are going to be true, whether it is a school or home or anything. But I do want to just remind everyone, we only can control ourselves.
Right.
Darn it.
I know.
Yes.
Such a bummer.
Well, thanks for a great conversation, Tina. We hope to welcome you back as a feature guest in Fanland. You know how to find us. We would love to host you. You have great energy, and we love your writing partner as well. We were thrilled to host him, and who knows, maybe 2 of you could be back on screen. That would be lovely.
That would be
but thank you for your time tonight. We really appreciate it. You did a great job, and thanks
Thank
everybody for
you.
coming. And we hope to welcome you back to more programming later this month.